Jonas Alves, who is our co-founder and CEO here at ABsmartly. He was the force behind the pioneering team at Booking.com, which he built up from 2 people to 800, and running thousands of experiments simultaneously. Following this, he consulted for many companies such as Katawiki, and he founded Tripaneer. And this all led him to want to develop a tool that provides an alternative to building in-house experimentation platforms. And that's how ABsmartly was born. Our second brilliant speaker is Lukas Vermeer. He's Senior Director of Experimentation at Vista. He's a public speaker, an author of multiple influential academic papers on the topic of online experimentation. And Lukas also spent 8 years at Booking.com leading the experimentation team there. His impact in the field of business experimentation was recognized in the Harvard Business Review story, Building a Culture of Experimentation. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Jonas and Lukas.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. I don't know about you, Jonas, but I always feel a little uncomfortable when people say nice things about me.
I feel the same.
Let's try to keep the tone a little light after this. So we have a tight schedule because we actually want to get through quite a few topics in a very limited amount of time, and we have several slides that sort of have questions on them or the things that we want to raise, and then the format is that Jonas and I will sort of banter about this for a few minutes, and then really like we're also looking for you, the audience, to participate and sort of share your view, because like it's not like we have all the answers here, right? We have ideas, but I'm also very curious what other people think. So shall we kick off, Jonas?
Let's do it.
Okay. So I think the first big one is definition question. Like, what do you actually mean by real time, Jonas? Because like obviously it's not really real time, right?
Yeah, there's always latency, right?
Yeah.
So and that latency is created by multiple things, right? So first you need to send events in the website. You send an event of an event that the user did, right? That event needs to be collected, probably aggregated, and then loaded in the dashboard and shown in the reports, right? And this takes time. So it's never immediately, right? So, and how long is this latency? It depends on many different things, right? And from tool to tool, from infrastructure to infrastructure, depending on the pipeline that exists, right? How much was it at Booking, Lukas?
So this is a fun topic, because actually you mentioned like different architecture has different implications for latency. I don't know if you remember, but by the time you were on your way out and I took over experimentation platform, there were actually two infrastructures in place. One was a streaming based infrastructure that's very similar to how ABsmartly works today, I think, which was very fast. And the other was a Hadoop based or a big data, like a warehouse native approach. And actually the booking tool was using both at the same time. And one, I think, had an SLA of like 1 or 2 minutes, so relatively quick. And the Hadoop based was at most, I think, an hour was like the fastest we could do. And that had to do with ingestion of events and how often tables from other systems were being imported into Hadoop. So for example, we wanted to do reporting on conversion or how many bookings we were making. And it turned out that the table we were using that had the actual bookings in it was loaded only once a day. And so like we could probably run our reports like more than once a day, but we wouldn't actually have any bookings data. And so in that case, like the SLA isn't even driven by the platform, it's driven by the underlying architecture and like teams you depend on that are pushing in the data that you need.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's a very good point, right? Because sometimes the data only, let's say that we use a warehouse native approach, like the data only reaches the warehouse or is only aggregated in the warehouse like once an hour.
Yeah.
Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes once per day, right?
Yes.
And that limits, even if the dashboards are pretty quick at loading the data, that already adds that latency, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it might like the screen might load very fast, right? But you're not seeing recent data. Like there's latency between when a customer was impacted and when you actually see the results. So when we're talking about real time, I think we have to draw a line in the sand somewhere and say like, well, if the total latency is less than, I don't know, a minute, are you comfortable with that? I'm actually curious, like if anyone has a strong opinion on this. Like what is real time? Like is it like a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes? Is a couple of hours, is that still real time? Anyone? Minutes, says Giuseppe. Yeah, I'm with you. I think if it's a few minutes, then it's probably still real time, even though technically it's not. 5 minute max. Okay. We've got a number now. I'm pretty sure like if we asked like a whole bunch of people to give us a number, we would get some sort of distribution that is fat-tailed maybe, but yeah. I think most people will use minutes to describe.
That's what you guys have, Stuart? 5 minutes?
Shall we move on? I think
Yeah,
we've defined real time now. So the next question we wanted to talk about. It's on the next slide. I forgot what the question was. Right. Why does it change things? So we want to do it and like a webinar about like the consequences of real time because I don't know about you, Jonas, but I think it's actually super important to have low latency. But I think maybe we should talk about the consequences of high latency first. Like if it's not minutes, but it takes, I don't know, a day for you to see data in an experiment, what do you think happens? Why is that bad?
Yeah, it's not only about taking longer to see the data, right? That actually makes changes and an impact in the way that people work and the processes that are used internally by the organization, right? And I think
Like
that
that?
we even add a really nice story from Netflix. I'm not sure if you want to tell it right away, but or maybe we can first discuss what kind of changes that that latency causes in terms of organization processes, right?
I think you mean LinkedIn, not Netflix.
I
Is
thought
it
it
the
was
speed
Netflix,
quality
maybe it's
risk paper?
LinkedIn. All right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, I'll tell the story, not if you ask. So there's this paper called Speed Quality Risk. It's a great paper. It's written by LinkedIn, and it's a very structured way of ramping up traffic. So the idea is that you start with a small percentage of traffic, and then you run the experiment for a while. You see whether it's safe, and then you ramp it up. You increase the traffic to say 10%. You see if it's safe, and then if that's still safe, then you ramp up to 100%. I read that paper many years ago when I was still at Booking, and one of the things in there is that they actively say it would be ideal if you can start at 100% of traffic split 50-50, because if you do that, you get maximum power. And so in an ideal scenario, you would get your result as quickly as possible if you start with 100% 50-50. But then they go on to say, but clearly that's impossible. And I remember reading that going like, wait, what? This is what Booking does all the time. So clearly there's some sort of underlying issue here that I'm not getting, like a difference in context. And years later, I talked to the team that wrote it, and the context they were working in is that the latency that they had for their reporting was I think it was like 24 or 36 hours at the minimum. And so if they started a test, it would take at least a day before they got any information about the outcome. And that's why they said, like, to mitigate risk, we have to start at 1%, because if we start at 50-50 split for 100% of traffic, like the amount of risk we would take as a business would simply be too great. And so to your earlier point, Jonas, I think like the higher latency in this case, the fact that it takes so long to get data changes the way that people perceive risk of rolling out an experiment, right? Because suddenly you're sort of flying blind for a day. That feels very risky. I'm not sure where LinkedIn. I mean, this is years ago, right? Maybe LinkedIn has like super low latency solution now, but at the time that seemed to be the thing that was driving the risk mitigation.
Yeah, there's a
Is that what
comment
you're
from
trying to say with like it drives behavior?
Sorry, Lucas. I
You
talked
said
on top of you.
the latency drives behavior. So I'm curious, is that what you meant, or were you thinking other things?
That's exactly what I meant. Yeah. And there's a comment from David that's exactly it, right? So if you cannot use with high latency, you cannot use it as a monitoring system, right? To catch early bugs, right? In
Right.
that case, you need to rely on something else other than your experimentation dashboards to make decisions on and act quicker on those, and that changes the way that people work internally, right? So people are more risk averse probably, right? Because they know that they'll not see results immediately. They probably need to use other tools like New Relic or whatever else for monitoring or internal tooling for monitoring. And probably they don't deploy stuff as quickly as they could to mitigate the
I
loss.
mean, playing devil's advocate, and thank you, David, for spoiler alert. Hi, David. But why can't they use New Relic in the same way then? Like, if you have some sort of like near real-time monitoring that's not an experimentation platform, but that's just like your regular production monitoring, why can't you go to 100% 50-50 split and just watch that monitoring instead of your experimentation platform? Wouldn't that work?
Maybe it works, and maybe for most of the situations that will be fine, but you have much less sensitivity, right? Because if you have bugs that happen on corner cases, on smaller amounts of traffic, those might be hidden in the numbers if you only look at totals of the website, right?
Yeah.
With an experiment, if something is broken in that experiment, you can see it right away in the experiment report, right? So you can catch those small bugs much quicker. And actually, there's a very nice example from my time at Booking where one experiment was hiding the book button on the hotel page for like, I don't know, a tiny part of the traffic. So it was like a corner case where some users would not get that button.
So it's
And that
very few
experiment,
people, but they literally can't give you money anymore.
exactly.
So it's a very bad bug, but for a very small audience. And it's probably one of those audiences that isn't in your normal QA process, right?
Exactly. Like this was not catched during QA, right? So we were doing QA before putting experiments in production, not very deep QA, as we can talk later.
Yeah.
But there was some QA, and this was not catched. The experiment was started and started negative right away. So we started seeing that conversion was dropping,
Yeah.
a small percentage, but it was becoming stronger and stronger. And
Did
someone
you see
from
the same in the top line? To your earlier point, like was the drop big enough that you could see it in the top line?
I don't recall what was the sensitivity that we had at the time, but it was below 1% impact, right?
Okay, yeah.
We could see impacts smaller than 1%.
Yeah, in an experiment, you can see
In
impact smaller than
in this
1%.
case, I don't recall what it was. I don't remember.
Yeah, but so in experiment you have more sensitivity. So in AB, you could pick up this small drop, and like you might have picked it up in sort of the top line. But if this is a small audience, then probably you missed it.
You could not see it in the top line, right?
Yeah.
It would be impossible, right? It was really a small amount of people, a corner case. And but we saw it right away, like in the dashboard, that the experiment was negative, and it stayed like that for a couple of hours. And then Timo from the experiment tool reached out to the team and said, "Hey guys, I believe that you guys have a bug. Like I have the feeling that this is not just a bad start of the experiment." And the team was, "Oh no, this happens all the time. Experiments that start really bad and then they recover." Timo said, "Well, I still feel that this is not okay." And by the end of the day, I think it was like 3 or 4 o'clock, Timo stopped the experiment and told them, "Hey guys, there's a bug in this experiment. Go figure it out."
I think the audience doesn't know Timo, so I think a little quantity like Timo is probably one of the nicest people on the planet. Like he is extremely nice as a person. But he's also very smart and he can be very definite. And so like the asking nicely several times and then actually pulling the plug himself sounds very much like Timo. Yeah. I miss you, Timo. So,
exactly. And then the team started digging, like using the segments and trying to figure out if there was a segment that was a negative. And they ended up finding out, hey, there's a segment here that is super negative, and they notice, okay, so for these users, we are not showing the book now button. So this brings another question, right? Even if you see data in real time, you might not want to act right away on it because you are not sure if it is a bug or not, right? So not the latency is not the everything that
the team
will
also
make.
has to believe it, you mean?
Exactly. That will make an impact on the processes, right? You still need to act on what you see, and you still need to have that sense, because sometimes it actually might be a bad start of the experiment, and many times it is. So you need to figure out, and hey, what is this? And that's why with more advanced reporting, where you have alerts about segments that might look super bad or something, this might help a lot in those cases as well.
You're essentially debugging now, right? But you have like a super sensitive debugging machine that is more sensitive than just looking at top line, where you can look at sort of a smaller delta between two variations, and then you can slice and dice and see like where might this issue be coming from. Like that just this morning I was looking at an experiment which seems to be doing really bad on iPhone. Like very quickly you can sort of dig in to go like, oh, there's probably an issue here that's worth visiting. There's one last thing I wanted to say here. That you say it's one thing that is sensitivity is high. There's another thing, the specificity is also higher. So the fact that you at this time Booking had what 100 development teams already, the fact that Timo was able to say this exact change is the one that is causing the issue, and that's the one that I'm going to revert. That's also something that you can only do if you have A/B testing as the way of doing this, right? Because otherwise, a release might have 10 or 20 or maybe 100 different changes over a day, and figuring out which of those changes caused the issue, even if you manage to find it, I think if you find a drop, then identifying where it came from is still a challenge. So I think why is real-time data for experimentation platforms such a game changer is because it allows you to do early detection with high specificity and high sensitivity of issues that you might have in production.
Exactly.
I summarize it well.
And basically, this means that if you don't ship all the changes in an A/B test, you lose that. Right? Then if you see problems, then you have to roll back the whole code and then git bisect until you find what is the issue on the website, right? So takes much longer to find what is the cause of a bug, and sometimes takes months until you actually discover that you have a bug.
I often joke that I think one of the reasons Booking did so well over the years wasn't necessarily that they were running amazing A/B tests and doing like very innovative things. I think a large part of the reason was they never shipped a bug, or not very big ones anyway. And I think that running everything as a test was the way they accomplished that. Should we move on to the next one, because we have a lot of content to get through. I see Mario put something, even very elaborate tests are not enough. Everything can be correct, but you can still have a terrible result. Example, the experiment is simply terrible. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a bug, right? I remember Booking ran experiments trying to comfort people in the checkout process by assuring them that their credit card details were safe. And like you would imagine that like if you make people feel comfortable about their transaction, then conversion goes up, right? More people are willing to give you money. And like again and again and again, they just showed the opposite, because it turns out that if you remind people of the fact that a transaction might not be safe, they actually hesitate more. And so like from an implementation point of view, there was nothing wrong. We just misjudged the psychology that is in play. Thanks for that, Mario. That's great. Okay, so how and when you would use this? I think we talked about this at length, Jonas. Do we have other examples of like very bad things that happened, or like very things that were caught by these mechanisms?
I think we have some examples from the circuit breaker, right? And this is more to when you start using this for every type of change, right? Even bug fixes are tested like this, right? Because then you can actually find very quickly if the bug fix actually broke something else in the website, which is not that infrequent, right?
I think we talked about changes to behavior before. Like I think one of the things that I noticed at Booking, this probably even before I joined, this is probably your era more, is that people were very happy to just try new things. Like the amount of new things that were being tried every day was very high, and I think people felt really comfortable putting stuff out there because they knew that if it was really bad, they would be able to detect it very quickly and turn it back, right? So there was a very, very high risk tolerance, to the point that I don't know if you remember, but the QA process at the time would start after experiments start. And so a developer would do their own QA, right? So they would check whether they thought that the code worked correctly. But the actual QA engineers, the people who were responsible for QAing stuff that went on the site, they were using experiments as a way to prioritize which things to even look at. And they were not a gate. So a developer could put something on the website and start running a test. And the QA engineers had a dashboard that showed all the currently live experiments sorted by amount of traffic and risk to impact. And they would just go down the list. And if something had very low traffic and very low risk to impact, they might not even get to it. And so they were prioritizing their QA based on impact rather than sort of like trying to QA everything. And so it's these sort of changes of behavior that you see in an organization that are driven by this.
And this is something that is not seen, at least I didn't see it anywhere else. And when I talk about this, there's a huge pushback from like engineers that are very strict about development processes and development best practices, because this sometimes goes against those best practices that
Right.
that have been, you know, from CI/CD. Maybe this changed a little bit, but even with CI/CD after that, QA is still there very strongly, right? And moving QA to when stuff is already in production, it's quite putting it backwards, right? So.
Yeah, I think I need to caveat here and say I don't think Booking was necessarily doing it right at the time. Like I think they went off the deep end and then some. It probably went a little bit too far. I do think that a little bit more QA. I actually argued with Brendan, the CTO at the time. I argued that we should do more QA, and he looked at me and said, "No, that's why I have you. Like your tool is the QA." And like, and so I was the one arguing for having a little bit more rigor in that process. It's probably a balance, right? But I think you're right that like most people we talk to in the sort of outside of Booking, they think that if you beef up the QA enough, like if we would just add more and more tests in our CI/CD, then we will be safe. And I think that is to Mario's point, right? That will never happen, right? Because your CI/CD will never be complete. It will never be comprehensive. There's always things going to be missing from your QA process. And so you need that, at least in my perception, you need that post-release monitoring anyway. Andrea has a point. Do you want to speak up, Andrea, or do you want me to read what you wrote?
No, that's fine. Sorry, I just left it there. No, it's interesting because I do agree and make good use of safety net, let's say, use of an A/B testing tool. But I always thought, maybe because I'm a core experimentation person and not an engineer, that in a way fills the gap of some missing tools and processes and functionalities that are in QA teams and engineering teams. No, like it shouldn't be delegated. Like I don't like when a way to sell an experiment is let's test this, so if there's a bug you're gonna see it, or so right. you de-risk it in that way. To me it should be more like you should de-risk it because you don't know the outcome of what you've done, not because you don't know what you've done.
Right. I think I don't know if you had the same, Jonas, but like the never end. Thank you, Andrea. The never-ending debate within the experimentation tool team when I was there was, is that an experiment? Yes or no? So if I have a bug fix, I'm convinced I need to put this bug fix out there, but I'm still going to run it as a controlled experiment for monitoring purpose. And so my hypothesis is essentially this is not going to break the website. And I'm going to run a controlled experiment to make sure it doesn't break the website. Is that an experiment, right? Or are we sort of in the realm of QA now? And like, should we separate that from regular A/B testing? I think I don't have an answer. I've noticed the same in Vista, by the way. When I say A/B testing and I talk about these use cases, they want to use different words to describe the same thing. They call it a percent rollout, whereas under the hood, it's the same mechanics, right? It's the same technology.
You can call it continuous integration with more sensitivity, right?
I sometimes call it the real integration testing. Because the integration testing, you take all the systems that are involved and you test them together, right? Except for the human that is also part of the larger ecosystem of your product. And so I think A/B testing is like the real integration testing, where you take all of the systems, including the human participant, and you test them all at once. It's a fixed experiment. Oh, thank you, David, for reminding me of that. That's Booking.com terminology right there. It's a fixed experiment. I think we talked about this. You mentioned the circuit breaker, Jonas. Should I quickly talk about that?
Yeah, if you could give like 1 or 2 examples.
Yeah, so the circuit breaker was a system that Iskra put in place. So one of the senior developers at Booking put in place, which took this idea to a little bit of an extreme, where the latency on the circuit breaker is 1/4 of a second, and it only monitors errors and warnings. So it does not look at any business metrics, only like does the page break or does the user encounter any user-facing errors. And then it automatically terminates experiments if there is a severe regression in errors or warnings. And so there's no more human in the loop now, or no one's actually making a decision. We're really using the experimentation platform under the hood as a continuous deployment, my automated canary release platform. Oh yeah, nowadays we would call it AI. Yeah, so it was an artificial intelligence which would automatically stop experiment. Really, like from a statistical point of view, it wasn't very rigid. I think this is something that we might also want to talk about, Jonas. Like the circuit breaker was trying to control risk at the expense of statistical rigor. And so the circuit breaker didn't even correct for multiple testing, for example. So just continuously tested and stopped when something looked really, really bad. Because you're really trying to stop super bad things. And so your example of hiding the book button wouldn't be caught. But I remember there was a fix experiment, to David's point, where someone tried to change the API on the booking process that was used to, I believe it was used to cancel bookings. And then turned out it was automatically canceling bookings. That was probably not what they wanted. And so that was rolled back within less than a second. And so it's good to have some sort of extra safety net in place. Should we move on to the next one?
We have 15 minutes left. How much time do we want to leave for people to ask questions? And
I think that's like I'm mostly curious. Like, does this resonate? Do people recognize these ideas? I think Andrea's point is very, very on point. Like, does this fill a gap that should be filled from something else, or do we even call this experimentation?
I think, Lukas, just to complete that, because I think we're on the same point, a lot changed when feature flagging tools became more and more the predominant choice for A/B testing. Like up until it was client-side testing, I think this was less of a use case, but then emerged more into the engineering world. And that's where it starts blurring and encapsulating other use cases. At least that's been my perception. Might be wrong, but
yeah, I think that's I've noticed a similar trend where like the feature flagging tools add experimentation capabilities, or the experimentation platforms, they add backend SDKs. So like these worlds are slowly colliding. I think for Jonas and me, like this was already like the world we lived in, right? So for I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to talk about that here, is because we noticed that this way of thinking about how you can use an experimentation platform isn't very common. Like, I don't think this is something where you talk to people, they realize that this sort of shift will present company accepted, Andre. But like, I don't think that's very normal. Do you see it in other places? I'm curious. I mean, certainly Vista, we're doing this to the point where we're now trying to automate any, like the CI/CD will create experiments that are then automatically run and rolled out. So there's no more human involved even. Just any check-in will result in an experiment. Are other companies doing this? Are you doing this, Andrea?
I wish. No, not yet. I think it heavily relies on the engineering team maturity, having these processes in place. You can join an organization where feature flags are already, let's say, widely used. So you just implement the experimentation side of things, where probably it's more like a statistical part and data collection and quality. But you can also be in situations where feature flags are not widely used and there's no this continuous cycle, of releasing, checking, and monitoring. So it's a double job. I don't think it should be probably the experimentation department to look after that. It's more an engineering problem, but they are heavily intersected, because the difference between a test and a release that is non-tested, let's say, but still tested, so not analyzed with, statistical analysis, is very subtle, very, very subtle.
I think you're making an assumption that probably is correct for a lot of organizations, but I just want to point it out that you're assuming that experimentation and engineering are not in the same place.
They should be, like, everybody aspires to the Booking.com model, Lucas. But realistically, if you take organizations, like experimentation is rarely, from my experience, at least in the UK, within the engineering team.
Yes.
It's more in product or other teams that are a bit further away from engineering.
That means that the engineering team is not in product, right? At Booking, the engineering team was product. If you have that separation, then things get a bit more complicated indeed. Yeah. Well, there was also engineering outside of product, of course, like infrastructure and that kind of stuff, right? But they would run experiments as well, right?
Yeah,
Because
I think when you were there, the experimentation team was part of the front end organization, right? So they're purely the website side of things.
But it was engineering, right? They had developers, they had designers, they had
Yes,
writers. Like the engineering was embedded into the team. So of course there was engineering outside of it as well, more focus on the back end, on infra, security, that kind of stuff. But they would run experiments too.
Well, that's where we moved. So after you left, we moved the experimentation team into what was called core infrastructure, which was more of the underlying infrastructure, because we didn't want to be just the website. We wanted to be website and the partners and the care and everything. And so we deliberately moved it out of front end into core. But you're right, like all of these were product domains essentially, where you have product and engineering sit together. I also recognize, Andrea, like I do think this is the minority of companies, right? Where one, product and engineering often are separate, or UX and engineering are separate. There's not a lot of companies that use the product operating model, as far as I can tell. And the other is, like, even for the companies that use the product operating model, A/B testing or experimentation might not be embedded in the engineering organization. It might be something that marketing uses on the side, or that the product organization uses on the side.
And also, to add another flavor, in a way, the engineering one is even more challenging, because this use case, it really needs to be adopted by the whole engineering team. Whereas with the experimentation use case, you can always work with pockets of people that do it and some people that don't do it. But once you change your release cycle and processes, that's your entire engineering workforce that has to follow the same process, pretty much. So it's more standardized, even more.
Are you suggesting that it's harder to go down this route? I'm curious now. Do you think it's more difficult to go down the engineering route?
No, I culturally no, because I think that the benefits are more at the heart of the engineers. Like, they remove a pain that they experience, so I don't think it's harder. But there probably are more people impacted by that within the organization, or at least as a percentage of the team impacted by it, which means that in a way probably it's not harder, but probably will take a bit more effort or longer to implement in itself. Whereas, if as a single person, let's say a single experimentation person joins an organization, you can still work with pockets of PMs or people that want to run experiments. With engineering, you will have to take a holistic approach. You cannot just go with pockets, say one engineer does it and one engineer doesn't do it,
Yeah.
That was the idea.
I'm curious. We have other people on the call. Does anyone else have a view? Because
I believe it depends how you provide the solution for an engineer to use, and if it's easy to be used, integrated. If you push in that direction, and it's easy to be adopted, that will happen.
I do think engineers expect or think differently. I think that's a good point, Giuseppe. Like, engineers don't want a slick landing page that explains to them how much money they can make if they use this tool. They want a clear SDK documentation page where you can try something out and sort of build an MVP. So I think it does require a different approach. That's a good point. Anyone else? Stuart was being flippant earlier, but now he's quiet. Come on, Stuart. No.
We cannot hear you, Stuart.
Can't see you.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Much better now.
Put me on the spot twice.
Always.
Interestingly, at least I've been at my company for 6 years, and engineering was actually kind of the grassroots of where experimentation actually succeeded. And we found great success in baking in the concepts of feature flagging as a standard, and then almost experimentation being the next step on top of feature flagging as kind of just, I used to call feature flags naked experiments or experiments without metrics, right? So yeah, I've been kind of just soaking it all in and just kind of taking the different takes, but also kind of feeling quite grateful that actually we took the engineering first approach that says, you know, we will ship everything as an experiment behind these feature flags with the metrics on top with the confidence, and then we'll have that near real time, I guess, monitoring and impact, so that, you know, if we do have production incidents, bugs, things like that, we can pull them out, you know, in a timely fashion. That you know, the piece you spoke about with LinkedIn, I don't know when that was a challenge, you know, but like 24, 48 hours seems mental to have any kind of signal from your customers as to what is happening in that experience, right?
I think it's mental if you have the mindset. So thank you for sharing. I think RS is actually a great example of a company where feature flagging has sort of like been the gateway drug to A/B testing rather than the other way around. But I think if you think of A/B testing as like purely the experimental method, like the scientific method, where I'm going to run this experiment for 2 weeks and I'm going to analyze it and then make a decision, right? 36 hours isn't so bad. Because you're not even thinking about early stopping at this stage, right? You're not even thinking about using it as a monitoring device. And then like having such high latency isn't a problem. I also think like for LinkedIn specifically, and they were looking mostly at retention. And so there's an element of latency that we didn't talk about, which is like how long does it even take for a subject to respond to treatment? And if you want to measure like 1 day retention, 24 hours is the minimum anyway. So why would you build faster reporting? I think Booking was and many other e-commerce companies are in the lucky position where the latency on the metrics is actually quite short. And so the time between treatment and someone converting or progressing to the next step is so short that it's not a material part of the latency. Whereas for retention, obviously the latency between exposure and sort of outcome is much longer.
That's a very
There's
good point.
something that I've been curious about, and it didn't actually come up, but it was with regards to, and this isn't so much of a problem these days with some of the sequential stats methods that teams are adopting in modern tools, but is there an element of real-time monitoring of metrics encouraging peaking and the peaking problem in some respect? And there was someone who mentioned New Relic and kind of APM tools as a kind of, is your site broke versus do you have like a metric problem? And is there, I guess, open question, is there a consideration or challenge there as well?
I love that you brought this up. We deliberately didn't include statistics in the topics for today. I mean, yes, I think ideally you have some sort of rigorous statistical method that allows you to peak constantly. Even for this use case, there are still issues with like bias in the measurement if you use these sequential methods. I would not use them for shipping decisions other than GST, obviously. But I don't think that was the point we're trying to make, right? I think if you compare sort of peak, like if you think about peaking, you're still thinking about it in the experimentation context. But if you think of this as a complement to your New Relic reporting, which is just more sensitive and more specific than like watching the top line, I think there's very few. I mean, Booking was doing this, but I think there's very few companies who look at their top line and then do a prediction for how the top line is going to perform in the next few hours and do a double standard deviation correction on it to see whether what we're currently seeing is below expectation. Like most companies, they would look at the top line and go like, oh, that looks like a drop. And so looking at sort of like an A/B test is already more rigorous than that. And yes, ideally we would use some sort of sequential method, but I don't think that's the key we were trying to get at here. But thanks for raising it. I think it's a good topic. Maybe in next webinar.
I think it also depends on what we are looking at. Like you have the primary metric of the experiment, and you have the guardrails, right? And the guardrails, you want to look at them all the time, especially in the beginning. You want to look at them and make a quicker decision to stop experimentarily if something goes wrong.
Yeah, you
And the
want to
primary
be.
metric is something that you want to look more at longer term, right?
Yeah. Mario?
There's also another question that I was thinking. So you already mentioned, for example, for LinkedIn, it was all much more like long-term versus Booking.com, in which it's almost immediate, right? Like the type of metrics that they have. But what about those people that have like a startup in which, like, for example, they can just argue like, okay, with Booking, you have so much traffic that you can detect like 0.5% drop or whatever.
Right.
I have like a few thousand users per I don't know, per year or something, you know? I'm exaggerating, but you see my point, right? So what would be
Yeah, I mean, the point is real, but it applies like that point is a real problem that if you look at top line is only worse. Because the sensitivity of using A/B testing for this purpose is better than looking at the top line, and that scales with traffic. So if you have a lot of traffic, yeah, you can detect like tiny regressions. If you don't have a lot of traffic, it would be bigger regressions, but those regressions are still smaller than what you could detect if you were only looking at the top line as a startup. So I think like that yes, that problem is real, but it scales. Like that doesn't sort of undermine the value of using A/B testing in this way.
Yeah. I completely agree. I just wanted to make sure that we address this because I think, you know, it's very easy just to make that argument. Okay, whatever, Booking has a ton of traffic, so why is it important to me? You know?
Yeah, Ronnie and I actually wrote a thing about this where the irony is that business impact scales linearly. So if you have double the traffic or double the conversions, you have double the business impact. But power, so power to detect, is quadratic. And so to detect like half the impact, you need 4 times as much traffic. And so this means that the power, this power issue that you're talking about is actually bigger for bigger companies. That's why these companies are investing in Cupid and all these other sort of advanced methods, because for them, like a 0.5% drop is actually a whole lot of money. Whereas if you're a startup and you're worried about 0.5, like that's probably not what you need to be worrying about. You probably need to be worried about like 10% because you're a startup. Like you should be ready to pivot, you should be innovating, you should be moving fast. And so you like I think the problem is worse for the bigger companies, not the other way around.